Welcome to 20th Century Music and Arts. In this episode, we have part 2 of our interview with Byrne Power, best known for his channels Anadromist and the Anadromist. In this episode, we look at Byrne's experiences in New York City in the early 1990s. And what's great about this episode is that he includes a lot of his own personal photos from that time and some great clips. Please enjoy. Welcome to 20th Century Music and Arts. Today we are doing part 2 of our interview with Byrne Power about his life and experiences living in New York City and being involved in the music scene there and the art scenes there. When we were last interviewing him, we ended around the year, sort of around 1988, 89. So we're going to pick up from there. Hi, Byrne. How you doing?
I am great. Just came back from the new Alien movie, which I thought was worthy. Not quite up to the first two, but nevertheless. But yeah, things are good.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll see a review of that on your channel soon, hopefully. Maybe. So you had mentioned in the last interview that we did that your concert going, your interest in music, which had been really quite abundant in the early 80s, started tapering off, but then you started getting back into music around the end of the decade. So Can you talk about sort of that transition, maybe out of music and then getting back in?
The way it worked was that I was, I got a new job in 1989, and it was working for an art moving company, Waters Fine Art Service. And all the people I worked with were artists in some ways, like myself. I was working with some of my own kinds of drawings and paintings and such at that time. And part of the reason I got the job there was because I wanted to know were what I was doing in any way kind of interesting as art. To which the answer was yes and no. But I'm not going to go into that right now. So basically, I started meeting people. The job itself was absolutely amazing. I got into basically every museum in New York City. I got into almost every gallery. There were one or two I didn't get into, but almost every one. I met tons of artists in their studios, picking stuff up, people from Jeff Koons to George Segal to all these other people. Bumped into Andy Warhol. In fact, Warhol had died just when I started doing that, and so but he kind of hovered over so much of the work. But among the people that I worked with, there was a guy named Steve Doughton, who is a independent filmmaker and has made videos for various bands. He did some for Aphex Twin and some others. And we had a very good time talking to each other. Mark Waters, the guy who ran the business, would pair up two guys and we would travel around together, lifting and heavy art. And every now and then you'd get like, June day. And we were told, go pick up 150 paintings of various sizes, some very small, but some very large, at a guy's house. I can't remember his name, but he had all sorts of like toucans and monkeys in his house. His studio was in the same place, just crazy stuff. But and we were like dripping from the heat, and but at the same time, you'd get into some mansion in New Jersey. I remember this one mansion in New Jersey. We brought out a work of what I'd call commercial minimalism, and we spent 2 hours hanging it on the wall. Art moving is like the cream of the moving world, the cream of the crop, and we weren't all the way at the top in the art moving business, but we did see some very interesting, meet some very interesting people. But this one woman, we spent 2 hours hanging this painting. She walks in, says, "Wrong color, take it back." I was just like, okay, that tells me something. Tell me, if you had a Van Gogh, would you ask for it to be taken back? The answer is no, you'd change your house.
Yeah.
But then again, this work wasn't particularly memorable in any sense.
What kind of people were purchasing the art? I imagine some serious money here.
Yeah. I remember there was a place on Park Avenue, which is the richest avenue in New York City, and we'd go up there every now and then. I remember going up to this one guy's elevator, and he just said, before we left, he says, "I just need your autograph." And I said, "Why?" And he says, because I once had Andy Warhol deliver a painting to me, and I never got his autograph. And so ever since then, he gets everyone's autograph who walks through the door to deliver it. That guy had a massive collection. But a lot of stuff also went to, sometimes the moving would just be from artist to gallery or from gallery to museum or something like that. But we also had, there were a lot of corporate institutions that would buy art, which was also a very strange affair. Because, you take something to, Hartford, Connecticut for some insurance company, huge insurance company there. And I remember we arrived at lunchtime and they said, "Oh, you're going to have to wait." We had about 50 paintings to pick up. And as we were waiting, my friend Greg and I went down into they said, "Go, but you can go ahead into the cafeteria and get some food." So we went down there, waited in line. And we kind of look at each other back and forth. We're like, he was in various rock bands, made art, stuff like that. I'm whoever I am. And as we're looking around, he looks at me, "Are you getting the same feeling I'm getting?" And I said, "Yeah, high school." I says, "Exactly." And we looked around and there was kind of like the kind of cool CEO types sitting around with a bunch of girls around him, and then there was like the guys who are the drudges just typing away over in the corner, and then there's the same ethnic folks behind serving the food to us, and we looked at ourselves and we looked and said, "And we're still the strange guys here off in the corner." So it was very interesting. But talking to Steve got curious about what I was doing, and then he said, "Well, you ought to really come see some friends in a band of mine." And the name of the band was The Voluptuous Horror of Karen Black. And what can I tell you? I'm sitting there watching a band where the main singer is basically undressed with red paint all over her body, and it's just this weird show, partly sincere, partly completely ironic, all sorts of strange references to stuff. The music wasn't particularly exciting, but nevertheless, there was something going on there. She didn't have a great voice, but there was a moment at the end, all sorts of bizarre little plays and things were happening during the course of this. And she, at one point near the end, has herself turned upside down and has eggs filled with body paint cracked over the V, shall we say.
Yeah.
And I remember walking out of that going like, what in the world did I just see? And why? So that started me curious. I also started noticing that things were changing. I was probably the only period in my life I was staying at someone's house for a couple of years, and they had a television set. And I remember watching stuff like Faith No More's Epic and saying that's a bit different. And then noticing Sonic Youth, whom I had already had there Their first record was given to me a long time before. And their first record isn't particularly interesting, but I started noticing them and I said, that's interesting. And then I started going to more shows, and the more shows I went to during that period, the more I realized, okay, because I am above that age. This is for the Gen Xers. I am whatever, a boomer. And I realized, there's a wall of noise here. And that noise is to keep me out. I said, but once I stick my head into this world, assume noise is a given, and then listen to what's going on, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. And I realized, hey, I think we are arriving at a time much like the punk era, much like the hippie era, and it's a new time where things are happening. And so that happened by 1990. I was now starting to go to shows again. And again, part of it was just realizing things had changed enough that we were in a new world. Now, I will say this. I saw tons of shows in New York, but I never saw Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, any of those bands when they came through, because I have another rule, and that rule is I don't go to big shows generally. That isn't to say I've never been to big shows or wouldn't go to a big show, but generally it's kind of like, okay, if you've got an audience that big, audiences start to act weird when they get past a certain point, and they all take on a large hive mind, and they all kind of act together in a certain way. And so and some of the names I'm going to tell you here, I saw before they started playing larger gigs.
Yeah.
Because I was interested in that. But I was also just interested in the stuff on the ground. What's motivating people? How are they doing these things? So it was like a second round of this stuff. And you've been asking me about, well, did you see like the serious hardcore bands like the Cro-Mags and the Agnostic Front and that sort of stuff during the 80s? And the answer was no, because from my perspective, it was basically variations on the stuff that I had been interested in earlier, but to me, it didn't have enough melody, we'll say. But they were all moving towards this noise configuration. Yeah. And so the noise sound was out front, and then you'd listen behind it to what was going on. Yeah. And eventually I did get very interested and started buying a lot of records by a lot of different people during that time. Noise certainly didn't stop me from going to a band. In fact, there's one band I'm going to mention later that was the purest, most dark noise band I've ever run across. But we'll get there.
Okay, awesome. So this is around 89, 90. You're hearing more of these bands. So what were maybe some of the first bands besides the voluptuous horror of Karen Black? Karen Black, of course, being the actress that they're referencing. She was in Five Easy
Seasons. The 70s actress.
Yeah. So who were some of the bands that you started noticing? You mentioned Sonic Youth.
Bands like Babes in Toyland, and the Jesus Lizard, Unsane, and a bunch of other bands. Like I said, I've written down a bunch, but I'm sure I didn't write them all down, because with the last one, I actually found a list that I wrote down for 1 year of all the bands I'd seen. I don't think I did that at all during this period, for whatever reason. Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff I am forgetting, and bands I'm going like, who are those guys? Whatever. And so it's probably better if I go year by year than if I talk about one of the things that then happened was the owner of the art company I was moving for died. He had a brain hemorrhage and suddenly died.
Oh, wow.
And that kind of threw me into a unemployment circus for a little while. And then I started noticing something. I started noticing more and more. I would walk into the big Tower Records on 4th and Broadway, and they had an annex in the back where companies would be slaughtering off their vinyl. And I thought, that's really interesting. And I said, people still want vinyl. I should start buying some of this stuff, and I can sell it. And I said, where I was living at the time was in Soho, across the street from a really teeny independent store called Rocks in Your Head. And I went across the street. I'd been going in there already, and I went across the street. And one of the things I said is, "Hey, do you mind?" They paid me off the books, which worked really well with the unemployment money. But then I thought to myself, "Hey, what if I start selling used records or my own records out of here, stuff that I find?" And they said, "Oh, that would be fine." I said, "Well, here's what I'm thinking. The store gets a third, I get a third, and then I'll deal with however the other third goes." And they said, "Okay." So for starting in about 1990, going to about, I think I kind of weaned myself off of doing it by about 95, mid 95. And I had I would go to all these places looking for vinyl, which also meant I would go to, for instance, I'd heard there was still Jamaican vinyl out in Brooklyn. And I would go out there. Sometimes that was a little too expensive, but I'd buy a few, bring them back alive. Buy endless copies of these records I would find at Tower Records in their annex. So for instance, Folkways had this 2-record set in a box of the earliest international recordings by these 2 German guys who went around the world. These weren't 78s. These were wax cylinders.
Oh, boy.
And now, being creative, I said to myself, I can sell these. I write these elaborate notes on things. And the elaborate note that went on, I got about 15 of these boxes. The elaborate note that went on it is, "The last chance to get this. This is the most corroded sound you ever heard. It's industrial before industrial." And sold them all out in a couple of weeks.
So did Tower Records give you just the vinyl because they were tossing it?
No. I would just go buy them because they were selling them so cheaply.
Oh, okay, I see.
Yeah, I would pick that particular record was probably sold for about $3.99. I sold it for like $25.
Oh, I see. Okay.
There is a side of me that does know how to sell things. I don't activate it very much simply because you just start looking at everything like it's money, you know.
Yeah.
And I can't do that because I'm too interested in life. But basically, I did that. I got collections from different people I mentioned before. I got a very large collection of easily over 1,000 records from Tom Verlaine of television.
Yeah.
Tom Miller. And he and I made a deal where I said, okay, well, this is how I could go through these records here and I could buy them, basically it's going to be about $1 a piece. And I said, but they're worth more and I know they're worth more. So what we're going to do then is I'm going to take a third, the store is going to take a third, and you're going to take a third. And you'll come in the beginning every week or so and pick up the money. And that's what we did. It was a great arrangement. I also did the same with a guy named Sasha Frere Jones, who writes now for New Yorker, or at least last I knew he was. But he had his own band, and he had a collection he wanted to get rid of. And the biggest collection was from a guy, a good friend, Larry Sloman, we all called him Ratso, which he was named by Joan Baez. And Ratso knows everyone. He's friends with Bob Dylan. He's friends with Leonard Cohen. He's friends with Nick Cave. He's friends with all these other people. He knows so many people. But he used to work as an editor at National Lampoon. He also worked as an editor at High Times for a while. Or I think Harvard Lampoon. Anyway, whatever. He would get, because he wrote reviews and stuff, he would get free copies of all this stuff all throughout the 1970s.
Oh, wow.
And he took me to a storage unit where they were all just sitting there. And box after box after box of unplayed promotional copies from the 1970s. And so I said, okay, Ratso, this is what we're going to do, the 3-way split. And that's where I actually came up with the idea. Because there was another guy, I can't remember his name. He was in a San Francisco band called Minimal Man. It was
Oh
kind of
yeah, I know
connected.
Manolo Man. Yeah.
Yeah, connected with groups like Tuxedo Moon and The
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Residents, and that sort of thing. And I went up and bought a good chunk of his collection. But that was the first time I bought the collection at whatever I priced it at. But that's when I said, oh, I can't keep doing this because I'm putting out too much money. I'm not going to make any money if I do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we might come back to that. But it was really fascinating. I talked a bit about Tom Verlaine last week and knowing people like Larry. But it was Steve Doughton that opened the door. He also knew people in all sorts of other strange little New York bands and such. And I have a section here of bands that you probably only would have seen in New York at the time and didn't spread much beyond there. So there was a group, Blonde Redhead. They had a little bit of stuff, but I would see them regularly. And the guys would come into the Rocks in Your Head when I was there. I was there after a while, just about 15 hours a week. And then I'd make the rest of my money. I lived for 5 years just completely underground. And now that I'm retired, no one's ever asked me about it. So there's another group run by a famous in Japan Japanese comedian, Naoko, but it was called the Chimpanzees, and I have friends who played with her. And it was kind of what you would imagine if you think Japan and chimpanzees. It's like an anime group come to life, but doing kind of off-color weird stuff. Mm-hmm. and then my friend Sasha Frere-Jones had a band called Ooey, which was like this experimental bass and it was like bass and drum, but we're not talking bass and drum like electronic. We're talking, and it was prog influenced. It was John Zorn influenced.
Okay.
And it was jazz influenced in that sense as well, and funk influenced. But it was very spare, minimal kind of music, very interesting. And then there was another group that was very local called the Lone Wolves. And these guys, I can't even categorize them. We can say they're somewhere after Iggy and the Stooges. It's generally in that line, but I wouldn't call them a garage band. I wouldn't call them a grunge band or a noise band. They were just like, what can I say? Kind of sludgy, sloppy rockers, just New York. But I like some of their songs, and I have their what I'm sure is very rare piece of vinyl now, if anyone ever knew who they were. So I would be seeing those kinds, and I'm like I say, at this point, I am swallowing up at least 5 to 10 more names of just local bands that I was very familiar with. Oh, and then there was a friend I met through different circumstances, Boo Trundle, who did kind of a singer-songwriter thing, and I would go visit her shows quite regularly. One person I forgot to mention in the discussion with James was Jane Hohenberger, who later became Jane LaCroix. And she was a singing poet. And I knew her more towards the end of my stay in New York City, but I didn't want to leave her out because she was very important as a friend in New York City and very important as an artist, musician and writer. And just wanted to make sure I mentioned her. So that's the kind of thing I was going and seeing these different kinds of bands, often just following the breadcrumbs. For instance, the Blonde Redhead, Voluptuous Horror, Karen Black, the Chimpanzees, Ooey, Lone Wolves. They all weren't each other's friends, but there was a way in which they were connected. So that was interesting.
Did you ever come across, and I never really heard their music at the time, but there was an artist who called themselves Missing Foundation.
Oh, yeah. Well, they used to put up their posters all over New York City, and they'd always be referencing 1933 in Germany, and as if we were there again in America, which seems quite ironic and weird when you think of it. It's just like, no, I guess we weren't. But there obviously they were some sort of aggressive propaganda band, and those tend to really not interest me because it's like, okay, every now and then I'd run into somebody who was doing that kind of stuff, and I'd just be like, okay, I'll listen to them.
Were there a lot of bands like I've heard of a band called Rat at Rat R. Did that name?
Yeah, you're digging in the same well here.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were a bunch of strange bands in New York. Let's see, did I ever see the Reverb MFers? If you take the whole name, yeah, I did actually. Then who else? Did I see the Lunatics?
Yeah, they have that kind
There
of.
were a bunch of bands that were always crawling along the bottom of the New York.
And there was that whole kind of ironic.
Oh, Cop Shoot Cop. That was one.
Yeah, Cop Shoot Cop. Yeah, that was another.
Yeah. And I saw them. I didn't even write them down. Like I say, you're kind of jogging my memory of some of the stuff that I didn't write down.
And what about some of the stuff? Did you catch bands like Pussy Galore or Royal Trucks, stuff like that?
Oh, that's it. Oh, no, neither of those. However, I can do you one better. Let me give you some of the bands that I saw. Okay, so I saw PJ Harvey when she was doing her first tour at CBGB's, and I'm standing. I am. Let's see. That's how close I was to her.
Okay, wow.
The whole time, along with other people that were there. There was only a handful of us who seemed to really know who she was at the time.
Yeah.
She was coming to New York, doing her first tour, promoting herself. But yeah, and CBGB's stage is only a couple feet off the ground, half a meter. So maybe a couple feet. Yeah, it's just not that high. So the whole time you're just sitting there. I used to love going to CBGB's and stand behind the immediate front row. There's no row, immediate stage, off to the side a bit, because the speakers were all facing out the other way, and I did not want to go deaf. So
yeah.
Also, in a similar situation, also at CBGB's, I saw Babes in Toyland.
Yeah, and
that was quite interesting, and it made me think. Actually, there's a story I've come up with here where I'll mention a bit more about a slight connection with them. But you'd suddenly see these bands. Now that was part of something that I guess they were shooting for a video for Warner Brothers, because they'd already signed made their big sign for Warner Brothers and such. Also, I saw Sonic Youth, and I saw they were playing in Central Park, and I went and saw them. Oh, again, they were a band I normally wouldn't go see because they were already too big. But the nice thing is, the collections I had of music and such, one of the people I attracted, particularly with the stuff from Ratso and Tom Verlaine, was Thurston Moore from Sonic Youth. He would come in quite often, and I'd walk past him and go, "Hey, Thurston," and we'd start talking. He said, "Did you get any more of those weird early electronic things?" I said, "Yeah, I did actually." And so we, he knew me well enough to.
So he was really into avant-garde music.
Yeah. He was not coming in buying any hardcore. He wasn't buying any new grunge or noise bands or alternative bands. I mean, I'm sure he bought a few of that stuff, but what he was looking for was either avant-garde, early avant-garde, synthesizer, classical, and jazz.
Okay, wow.
And I remember getting one collection, and I was trying to figure out, I was going through it trying to go like, okay, is this avant-garde jazz or is this avant-garde classical? Which way does this go? And I finally learned that all the avant-garde jazz had a bass guitar in it.
Yeah, that's right.
And usually the classical didn't. So, and of course, Sonic Youth was a part of the noise scene, which was still in swing at that time. Although I never saw Live Skull, I did not only see, but spent quite a bit of time with Band of Susans. And I consider Band of Susans to be better than Sonic Youth. They just had a completely different approach. All of them are coming from people like Lamont Young, and who's the other one? Glenn Branca.
Yeah. More? Rhys Chapman, I think, was another guy who did guitar.
Rhys Chapman, yeah. And so they're coming from those people. And in fact, Robert Poss of Band of Susans was basically had worked with Reese Chapman quite a few times,
right.
and produced, I think, at least one vinyl album. Robert was just like really happy to promote his band, and he still is that way, even though the band is not functioning. He has a Facebook page, and you can go, be his friend.
He commented. I put one of my videos on this noise rock page, and he commented on it, and I just gave him a comment saying your band was awesome, and yeah,
right. Yeah, and he loves doing that. My best friend in the band was Susan Stenger, who fortunately for her, but unfortunately for our friendship, moved to London to be with her husband. And I guess there was something going on there. And so I kind of lost touch with her because this was in like 95, and she's certainly nowhere on social media. I don't think she even had email for quite a while. So I kind of lost touch with her. But we used to go to movies together and such. Interestingly enough, though, here's another story. I should have mentioned this last week, but I forgot. The same friend who was with a guy named Tom, who was with Lydia Lunch, was with Lydia Lunch and Nick Cave. And they went to see Evil Dead together on 42nd Street. Now, what's interesting about that is Nick then wrote a song called Into the Woods.
Yeah. Deep in the Woods, yeah.
And if you listen to that song, you go like, he could only have seen Evil Dead.
Yeah.
And so my friend was with him when he saw that. My friend also said at that time he was just like totally twisted on heroin and such.
Yeah.
And so that was one of the things that just kind of kept me away, as I had heard about their shows. And at that time, he would hit people with the microphone stand, and not necessarily the tall end, but the heavy.
That's true.
So I just kind of kept my distance, but I bought his records all the way through because I felt him changing. And later, my friend Ratso took me to meet him at the Big Tower Records in New York City. He had about 200 or more people outside waiting. I met him for a second. I really wanted to talk to him, really did. But I looked at all those people. I looked at him. I knew he was just going to plow through this. And I just said, this is just not the time. So I said, hi, Nick. I've been listening to you for a while. He goes, all right, thanks. And then he went out. So, yeah. But so, I have crossed paths with him in different sorts of ways. But, and that was meeting him was in the early 90s.
Yeah.
So when there was still a Tower Records. Let's see. Another person I saw, I don't know if you know her, Lisa Germano.
Lisa Germano, no.
Yeah, Lisa Germano, she was actually, she became a singer. There were these female singers in the early 90s who were not exactly the same as, what can we say? They weren't like the singer-songwriters of the past. They were a new kind of singer-songwriter, and she was one of those. And the songs are much darker. And you could put Juliana Hatfield in there. You could put Cattell Kennick would go in there, Lisa Germano. Eventually, that style starts getting essentially commercialized through people like Alanis Morissette.
But Sarah
there was so I saw her play, and she was a very good performer. Evidently, she had some problems in her own life. I did talk to her briefly, but I could tell, okay, it's just like she's dealing with something. I would say one of my absolute favorite performances was I went to the Mercury Lounge. It was about 94, 95, and saw Mazzy Star play.
Oh, wow. Yeah, they're fantastic.
And it was when they were at their peak. And what's her name?
Hope Sandoval, I believe.
Hope Sandoval. She was just absolutely mesmerizing. She didn't hardly move a muscle.
Yeah.
And she was absolutely mesmerizing. I'd never seen anyone else do that. She'd just be like standing there, like kind of like, lost. And it was an amazing performance, and I really loved seeing that. Also, around that time, at the same place, Mercury Lounge, I saw Sam Phillips, who had been a Christian singer under the name Leslie Phillips, but she started putting out some interesting late period singer-songwriter albums. And but she came there with her husband at the time, T-Bone Burnett.
Yeah.
And so I talked to him again, and that was good. And then I saw Luscious Jackson.
Yeah, I know them. Yeah, I remember them.
Yeah,
they were with the Beastie Boys label or something.
Loosely connected to the Beastie Boys.
That's right. Yeah.
They played at CBGB's. And then there was I think it's, was it a double bill actually of Unsane and Jesus Lizard? This was just brutal. This was brutal. But it really showed me something, just like.
Well, Unsane's definitely a brutal plotting band. Jesus Lizard's quite a complex band. Like those guys are amazing musicians, but the singer would just jump in the audience and be all over the place. But the actual music is amazing. Yeah, I saw them live. They were incredible live.
Yeah. But that double bill, sometimes it's a double bill that gets you,
Yeah, yeah.
And that double bill really made me go like, what in the world's going on? That was fairly early. That was probably about 1990 or early 91 or something.
Yeah.
And there's definitely.
Go ahead. I was just going to ask a question that there must have been, and I noticed this in my own experience. I was a teenager when you were this era that you're talking about, but there's definitely a drawing line. It doesn't happen immediately in the fall of 91, but definitely by early 1992, Nirvana's broke through. So all that underground stuff is now coming up to the surface and the mainstream.
Exactly. So I can tell
you notice that happening.
Yeah, so I can tell you for certain I saw Babes in Toyland after that.
Okay.
And Nirvana, we were there. I was working at this independent store when Nirvana came out. You felt that almost instantly. Mm-hmm. It took about a month, and you just felt everything just changed.
Yeah.
Everywhere you went, people who were like in their mid to late 20s were listening to Nirvana, as well as the teens.
Yeah.
You'd hear it at everyone's house. And, you couldn't find anyone who would talk bad about Nirvana. Every now and then you meet someone who goes like, well, they're just doing the same kind of rock they've always done. It's a little louder and quieter here, but that would be people a little older. I turned 40 in 95. So that lets you know where I was chronologically at that time. Let's see, who else did I see? Betty Serveert, who was another of the Matador bands. Some of these like Fletcher Jackson and some of these others were on Matador. They were a Dutch band. They were pleasant. And then I saw Jawbreaker, but didn't really stick with me. It wasn't that interesting to me. And then we come to John Spencer Blues Explosion.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think what happened first. I ended up living across the hall from him for about 2 or 3 years, 2 years at least. And I invited him and Christina Martinez, his wife, over. I saw them play multiple times, starting in some of their smallest gigs. I bumped into him in, I think, 1998 in Los Angeles. And I got to go into a large show he was doing there, I think right near the Capitol building. And I just said, tell John Byrne is here. And he was like, okay. And, he was happy to see me. But he was very, very interesting. And he had a lot of, he on one level is very ironic, as one could tell from the Pussy Galore albums. But on another hand, he was doing something different by going back to kind of a bluesy, funky approach, but with added noise. He was doing something very different. And I guessed that. Later, some of his albums have come out, and I'm going like, he's actually gotten a bit serious here. But for instance, when I had him and Christina over one time, I was playing him like albums by Tony Joe White and Roy Head and all these like country funk albums from the late 60s, early 70s that he had never heard before. And that was really like, wow. He was just laughing. That was just incredible stuff to him. So I had a pretty good relationship with him. I'd bump into him all the time. At a certain point, however, he decided to leave, and he left his house to another guy named Stu who was in a band called Lubricated Goat.
Oh, they're Australian, aren't they?
Yes, they were. And he had come there. I think the band had collapsed while he was in New York City, but he knew John and Christina. They left him his house. What I don't think they realized was how much of a junkie he was.
Oh,
so suddenly, I mean, this was during a period where it was such a dark period in New York. I mean, I won't go into all the violence and murders and crazy stuff I saw just in this one place on Clinton Street. And the building itself was full of interesting people. There was a guy named Carlo McCormick who lived upstairs from me, who wrote art criticism for various magazines and journals and such. And they're just very interesting people. There was people cook and crack down in the bodega below me. Junkies would sometimes be in the door. You had to learn how to get them out. To which me, it would just be like out. I had a friend though who, smaller female type. She learned how valuable a plastic bag with a frozen Haagen-Dazs container could be.
Oh.
So, yeah, it was a very interesting time. But this guy, what he did, he decided he was basically, I believe, the boyfriend of Kat Bjelland from Babes in Toyland. And I remember one day looking outside the window, and I saw her coming into my building and then going back out again. And I think he was thinking to himself something like, I'm going to do something. We'll make it work. It didn't work. And I think he got really depressed right after that. And I had a friend named Doug who was in the area. He was actually staying with me for a month or two in my place. And he got to know this guy, Stu. And what happened was one day we come in and Stu is no longer in that apartment. There is a pimp who is renting out a woman from that room.
Oh boy.
And we're going like, what's going on here? Well, what's going on is that Stu decided to try to extract himself from the land of the living. And so what he did was he shot up all this junk.
Yeah.
And he thought that would be it. And then he woke up and then he realized he had spent all this money on this junk. And it didn't do the job. And now he owed lots of money. And so he was forced to give the guy the room.
This is some dark stuff.
Tell me about dark stuff and the music scene in New York City. It's just like it's like every girl I knew there seemed to be like a dominatrix or worked as a go-go dancer or something. And amongst people, there's something to be written about the relationship of the underground counterculture and organized crime that has never been written. Because it's just like, it's a very underground history, but I kept running into it.
Yeah. But a lot of those people who get into underground music are often people who come in from the suburbs. And if they're messing with people in organized crime, a lot of the time they're probably way in over their head.
Part of the idea is that you get in your idea of, particularly during this period, of rock and roll, rock music, whatever, punk, as a rebellion. So you're coming in from another place. You often don't know where you are even. You have this idea of how rock and roll goes and everything, but you don't really understand something. And I think that this is how people get tricked into all sorts of things. I mean, you'd see people just on the streets who'd come there and, like hardcore punks, crusties, all sorts of other folks. And they're naive kids who are quickly losing their naivete about the underbelly.
Yeah. Midnight Cowboy.
Yeah. Well, very different than that, because now you're talking about a Midnight Cowboy is still kind of in the world of the 50s in a way.
Yeah.
Whereas this is now, so a group of 6 people are living in a squat. What are the relationships between people? Really complicated and dark.
Yeah.
It's them doing it to themselves, essentially. And then, drugs factor in, all sorts of other stuff does. And then someone says, I want to be in a rock band. So it's all part of the same stew in a way. And then there were more garage type bands that I would see, like the Devil Dogs, New Bomb Turks.
Oh, New Bomb Turks, amazing. Yeah.
And coming up from, I believe, Virginia, it was the Candy Snatchers, which was one of the weirdest shows I ever saw.
Yeah, you mentioned that before.
Yeah, this guy is cutting himself on the forehead. Blood is running down. Broken beer bottles on the stage and on the floor. People rolling around in the mosh pit. These guys bring in a full-size sturgeon, which is bigger than that. It's just
fish too.
and they're hitting each other with it.
Yeah.
And getting bloody from it. It's just like, and I'm sitting there going like, this was about a year before I left. And I said, I'm getting too old for this.
Did you see the Lazy Cowgirls? They were in that garage funk. I don't know if they're from, I can't remember from New York.
It sounds really familiar.
And
like I said, I was at different garage festivals and stuff where I saw a bunch of small bands that I can't list them all off, unfortunately. But, and then kind of off to the side, but I ran into these people while I was taking the Voluptuous Horror of Karen Black around. I became their tour manager for a summer. But in Oregon, we ran into, we suddenly found ourselves second on the bill to the Cherry Poppin' Daddies.
On the same bill? Wow.
Yeah, in Portland. And I just thought it was so strange. And at this point, and we're sitting there going, who are these people? And why are they like acting like it's the 1940s?
Yeah.
And yes, this neo swing stuff. And all the kids seem to be there for them. And now you've got this weird underground band coming on up first. Very weird scene. And I'm watching the band afterwards. I remember that show very well because I had to try to, they had talked us down from being headline, so they thought they could pay us less money, and I had to get the money. So, but that's when I said to myself, everything's changing now.
Yeah. Well, I remember in Toronto there was a neo swing movement where they had like clubs where people just tried to recreate the 30s. This is about 1998.
Well, exactly. That went alongside of the pop punk of the late 90s and alongside of the neo ska stuff.
Yeah.
And it was all, I look at that as all kind of one thing. Because it was taking things that had been popular before and kind of amping them up, but in the same process, making them more juvenile.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really interesting. Have you ever heard of Suck Dog?
Because of my interactions with you, that's how I become familiar. But maybe explain to the audience who they are.
Yeah, well, there's Lisa Carver, who's basically the person who is behind it. She makes the Voluptuous Horror of Karen Black look like PG. And this weird stuff. She had her French friend, I have his album, but I'm skipping on his name right now. But I got in touch with her through her magazine because she had written this one piece that I just thought was really fascinating. She's actually a very, very intelligent woman. And she ends up becoming like, is it married to Boyd Rice? Do you know who Boyd Rice is?
I know Boyd Rice is, yeah.
Yeah. And I think they had one child. It's just bizarre stuff. Anyway, I sent her a few letters asking her about this one essay she had written. We stayed in touch, and then I came and saw her when she played in New York and walked out suitably. She is like one step up from Gigi Allen.
Oh,
and she was
is
also
that possible?
She's also, speaking of Gigi, one of the big moments of my time in New York City was I did not ever see Gigi Allen. Not in concert, not on the street.
That's probably okay.
It is. But I was friends with some of the kinds of guys who would go to see G.G. Allin. And we're talking about a very bottom feeder kind of hardcore punk person. And he did his last show basically, I don't know, about less than a block from me at this place called Gargoyle Mécanique. And I won't go into describing all the things he would do during his shows because nobody really needs to hear it. But it was just so scatological, so obscene and such. But he was at the point where it's like he was living in such a sense of degradation, of pain, of anger, that he decided again, like the guy from Lubricated Goat, he was going to use the Junk Express. Well, in this case, it worked.
Well, what I think happened, from what I understand, is he actually wasn't a regular user. He would just do stuff when people gave it to him. And he had been drinking all day, and then he took some because they just said, "Here, have this."
He had more than some. It was quite a bit.
Yeah, like, and, but he would just
he left this world in an apartment very close to where I lived. I mean, literally, I could just walk outside, walk across the street, and in a minute and a half, I would be there.
Yeah.
So, but my friends who were Gigi fans were very sad, and at the same time disappointed in him because he didn't take anyone out with him.
Yeah, that's what he promised to do. Yeah,
right. And that's the kind of person who would go to a show of his, hoping that this is the day he turns all hell loose.
And what's funny is you get, with then something a few years later, around the same time, a little bit later, a commercialization in a sense of that was something like Marilyn Manson saying, I'm going to then market the nihilism with corporate America's help across the suburbs of the US. It's very interesting.
Yeah. Well, I look at a lot of these people as being the first of the kind of people we would now see just living in just a strange sort of ways, and living without any meaning. The difference between these people and the kind of people you see today that on college campuses and such is very few of these people had a political bone in their bodies.
No.
I think they would agree with many of the things said today, but not in a political way. No. So they weren't out there protesting for trans rights, although I certainly hung out with trans individuals at that time, but they were very far and few in between.
Yeah.
And I mean, New York City had quite a few people of different, shall we say, identities.
Yeah, but, for sure.
But let's see.
So,
one person I met during this time was I went to a friend of mine, Steve Stein, whom I didn't talk about last time, who I really should talk about. AKA Steinsky, was the guy who was between the rappers on the Wheels of Steel and then the people doing sampling later to make music out of it. And the reason he was in between was because he was starting to make separate songs based on other songs. And so he's really the first person. Like the people on the Wheels of Steel were they had to follow the records. Yeah. Whereas he didn't, because he started off cutting and pasting it with tape, reel-to-reel tape, and then he eventually switched over to digital. Maybe I will stop what we're doing here, play you a moment of it, and then come back.
We take you to the Hotel Martinet in Brooklyn, where Bobby Millett and his orchestra are offering a program of dance music.
Lesson 2.
I'd like to know, are you really ready for some super dynamite soul? Introducing the world's greatest entertainer, Mr. Dynamite, the amazing Mr. Please Please himself, the hardest working man in show business. Ladies and gentlemen, the star of the show, Jay!
Brown.
Get up, get on up, get up, get on up.
say, children, what does it all mean?
We became very good friends, and for several reasons. One, I was already doing my own weird tape kind of experiments, which are in a totally different way. Later, they would call what I was doing turntablism, but I wasn't doing it with a turntable. I was, again, actually, I was in the beginning. I had two turntables in the disco section of J&R Music World, and I would run these things over each other. But I wasn't interested in that. I was interested more in creating the sound collages and such.
Do you have any recordings still of that?
Yeah. And I'm going to put some on my Lacrimatorium channel at some point here. I've got a few copies.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Although the sound quality is not particularly good, so I'm only putting the ones that I think might communicate. But he came in, he was looking for music. We got to talking, and turned out I probably found him in the spoken word section that I took care of. And because both of us, we are the only people either of us know who has a collection of spoken word records and discs as big as we do. I certainly have over 1,000.
Who's the guy who how do we say that? Canceled himself from life. Is it Steven Bernstein or someone like that? He looked like a horn rimmed glasses. Was that
Yeah. But I believe he was out of Seattle.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, but he was around that time, I think.
Yeah, and actually, I believe it was Steve Stein who turned me on to him.
Yeah,
he used him used part of his thing. At that point, everything Steve Stein was doing was against the law, because he was totally not using. He did do. He got his name doing this. He was actually working in advertising, and he would do these James Brown parties for people. But he got his name because he won a Tommy Boy Records contest in the early 80s of mixing. And so that is, I believe, available. But then a lot of his stuff, I have these CDs that he gave me that has all the stuff that, you can play it on a radio, but you can't put it on YouTube. Or maybe you can, because, well, there's just so many samples and such. He would sample Michael Jackson, Stevie Wonder. He would sample television shows from the 1950s. He would sample anything, James Brown, all this stuff. And that gave the idea. Like, a little bit later, if you were hearing, who are those two guys? It Takes Two. They were doing that, and you hear James Brown.
That's not something.
Yeah, well, Stein
that's not my area of expertise, but yeah, I know who that is. Yeah,
and you hear that.
Yeah,
this James Brown voice, which
yeah.
Which brings us. I mentioned Gargoyle Mécanique a minute ago, which is very weird, very strange club, and they had a garden next to it, which had all of these. Kind of wrought iron sculptures and fencing and all this stuff kind of like welded together. And they had that over the main entrance to the club as well. And it was just kind of a storefront in a small club. But the weirdest club I ever saw in New York City was at Gargoyle Mécanique. And it was a group called Macra Nympha out of Pittsburgh. And they were preceded by a Japanese noise band who unfortunately has, I guess they drove out of my mind.
The Boredoms?
No, it wasn't anyone
Ultra
famous.
B-Day?
Hmm?
Ultra B-Day?
No.
Okay. Oh, by the way, that song was by It Takes Two was by Rob Bass and DJ Easy Rock. That's right.
Right.
Now remember.
Yeah. And James Brown became popular for sampling after Steinsky, essentially.
Yeah.
He wasn't the only one, but certainly his records that all the DJs knew had it. But so I went to this band. Now they look like a normal band as far as their instrumentation. You know, drum, guitar, you know, bass, some sort of keyboard. No singing. 45 minutes of the most ear-splitting noise I've ever heard in my life. That sounded somewhere between a washing machine and guitars just left on pure feedback.
Oof.
And I walked up to the guy afterwards and I said, so was the point of that to cause pain? And he looks at me and goes, you got it, exactly.
Oh, boy. Interesting.
Because that's where the extremes were going. I mean, I met a guy the next day. I was at a flea market and bumped into a friend of mine. Then he had someone he knew walked up and we were talking about, I was telling him about Macronympha. And then this guy said, yeah, I've wanted to make music that's just pink noise. You know, I want people's ears to bleed. I'm going like, what's going on here? And there were some very strange bands by the end of the decade that didn't get much in terms of any airplay, but were so extreme. But very few people followed those people down to the pits, you know.
So how did then you doing the various jobs you have in record stores, selling record collections, how did you manage to become a tour manager for the voluptuous horror of
just because I knew
Carolina?
those people quite well.
So did they go on tour regularly or did they mostly play around New York?
Well, they mostly played in the area. And then they made shorter excursions, but then they were going to do their first national trip, which included Canada as well. They went to Montreal, Ottawa, and Toronto.
Oh, okay.
And you'll appreciate this. So the lead singer, Kembra, in her own words, is a minor cultural icon. We get to we've just played in Detroit. We're coming over the border into Windsor.
Yeah.
And I tell her, please, she was very capable of kind of like acting kind of pissy. And I said, please, when we get to the border, just be really nice. And they won't, it won't take very long. Well, we get to the border in an RV with all these weird looking people. And the Canadian border guards come out and they open the door on the side of the RV and she's sleeping. I told her not to, but this was like babysitting. She's sleeping in the back in the bed and she goes, who is that? That's all they needed to hear was that attitude. They had us for an hour.
Oh boy. Yeah. They can be tough. They can be.
Yeah.
tough.
You don't do that at borders. You don't give them any attitude. And the Canadians are much milder than the Americans on that stuff, but still I was just too blatant. They had to get it. So, but yeah, so I took them around and the reason they got me is because, I had seen them play, I don't know, 20 times. I was friends with them. I knew all the splinter bands that came off from their fans and all the rest of it. The Chimpanzees would be one of those. And so I just got to know them. I kind of felt for them because I felt like, as I told Samoa, who's the Japanese guitar player, I said, I feel like you're like children who don't have any of the old culture anymore, and you're trying to find ways to celebrate.
Interesting.
And he liked that definition. And I just felt a lot of the people in New York, I just felt where, they cut off the older culture and they were living in this new world. And they just didn't, they felt like they were inventing anything. But the problem is you didn't have any Renaissance people here. You had people, what are graffiti artists and people who think art is just a couple of lines on a canvas or nobody does anything practical. What and the music they make is all ironic. What are these people going to do to create a new culture, to create a better culture? They don't have the answers. So, and in a sense, that's why I was there. I felt something for all of these people. I felt like, and I have photos, and I will attach some here, of these people coming over to my house and hanging out with people and such like that. And I just feel like to me, it was a very special time. I had not been doing any photography throughout the 80s in New York City, but then I started because I realized by 1993, I'm in a pretty unusual place here, a time. And it's funny to me, like being here in Tbilisi, in Georgia, you see someone you got some young girl who's got a tattoo, or, she's dyed her hair pink or something like this. I'm just going like, it's all just, I was with the people who were really doing this. Whereas what's happening now is just kind of a fashion. Maybe it means something. Maybe it says something politically, but.
Who did they play with besides the Cherry Poppin' Daddies?
Well, that was, I'm trying to remember. And this is where I didn't go into my my resources here and look it all up, because I like I said, I came up with all these names just off the top of my head.
Yeah.
And I was trying to think of the other bands they played with on the road. Did we play with some weird band in Dallas that was doing a mockery of death metal bands? I'm sure this band went nowhere. But it was so weird and funny. And every song they would do a slow song. And then in the middle of it, they'd just have some lung expelling burst of scream. And then they would go back to playing the song. And they did this for about 10 songs. I'm going like, what are these guys doing? I wish I knew their name, but I might have written it down.
Was the fans ever hostile to the band?
No, because I would say we were one level up from the Suck Dog and G.G. Allen people. So they were kind of bottom feeders and hipsters. Not hipsters. There were no hipsters yet. Hipsters being kind of an artificial scenester. I would call these people scenesters more than hipsters.
Yeah, yeah.
But one last thing to mention here. There was a whole month of John Zorn at the Knitting Factory.
Okay.
Just saying the word Knitting Factory suddenly tells me, oh yeah, there was a lot of bands. I forgot.
Yeah, there was a lot of. I asked you about the avant-garde jazz, and you said you weren't really following that in the early '80s. Was that here now in the Knitting Factory?
No, yeah. Well, in the early '80s, the only thing I would consider avant-garde was Lounge Lizards.
Yeah, that's great.
Who kind of go directly towards John Zorn's direction. Yeah. And what he does is, in my hearing, and he specifically did this with Naked City, which was the night I went.
Yeah.
The Boredoms, no.
Yeah, the Boredom.
They had the lead singer from the Boredoms there.
Yeah, so, what's his name? Yeah.
Yeah, I want to say it, but Yamamashita or something.
Yeah, that's right.
But what they did was they used styles the way other people use notes.
Yeah.
So they would improvise different styles. So that, like the John Zorn Naked City albums, you'll hear like hardcore punk followed by a saxophone solo followed by pure noise.
Yeah.
In like a minute and a half.
That's right.
Then the next song will be something else. And so
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. That was very important. I did, however, see Sun Ra play.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah. It was probably one of his last concerts. He opened up for Sonic Youth in the Park.
Yeah, that'd be incredible. Yeah.
And that was a great concert to see.
Yeah.
I failed to mention, I mentioned Steinsky, but I failed to mention that I went to get a job as a DJ, or at least not a job, but a slot as a DJ at WFMU in East Orange, but it broadcast into the city, which was considered essentially the premier weird independent radio station in America for quite a few years running. I don't know if they still are. But the person I went out with was DJ Spooky.
Oh,
and
wow. Okay.
he was this very, very intellectual guy doing turntablism and such. And we had a really interesting conversation. I could tell we were coming from two different worlds, but at the same time talking about the things that mattered. He ended up not being a DJ there, and I ended up being a DJ this was 95 for about 3 months or so, and then I went to Alaska to go scope things out. And the nice thing about doing that was having been a DJ there, that opened the doors in Alaska. And I would start off my show maybe with hardcore punk. Then I would go into, maybe I'd have a theme for the night. Then I would go and end up with Arvo Pärt at the end.
Yeah.
3 hours. I never knew where I was going to be drifting, but I know I did a show like that.
That's awesome.
And I think on cassettes, I have recordings of most of those, but those cassettes are not here.
So what, I guess, that'd be a good place to maybe wind down now. So what happened? You do those 3 months in New York City DJing. You're passionate.
Let me explain to you the most important day.
Okay, go for it.
The most important day, as one could imagine, was the day we found out Kurt Cobain was dead.
Yeah.
And I remember I was actually at this small Rocks in Your Head store when we heard that. And there were like some teenage kids there. They just looked like someone had just suddenly suffocated them. And they walked out like in a daze. That whole weekend, I remember wherever I met people, wherever I went to someone's house, everyone was in such a bad mood. And you could tell that this is what gave me the idea that's the end of rock as rebellion. Because even though everyone would have been too ironic to say that Kurt Cobain is a spokesman for a generation, blah, 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 nevertheless, he was. And that was a moment where you just say, it just seemed like immediately Green Day was pushed to the fore.
Yep.
And pop punk suddenly took over. And then you started getting underground stuff like, Tortoise or kind of post rock and you had a lot of lo-fi indie stuff, Palace and
Pavement and stuff like that. Yeah.
So, but I think that was the moment when I noticed, and I felt this even before that. I was asked to officiate at a wedding. I do have photos of this very crazy wedding of this Japanese comic and her performance artist boyfriend, who is just crazy in a good way. And when I was at the wedding, all these people were there. So many, maybe a third of the people I've mentioned here in one way or another. It was a very interesting time. And then I looked around during this wedding and I said, we're coming near the end. This whole moment in New York, this moment in culture is coming to an end. And within a month or so, Kurt Cobain was dead. You could feel you just start to feel the everything leaking out. Yeah. My friend Samoa, who was this Japanese guitar player, he was really into Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath and all this stuff, and would incorporate these kinds of riffs in the band, Voluptuous Horror of Karen Black. He said he went to the Limelight, which was this old Anglican Episcopalian church, which had been desacralized, decommissioned. Anyway, you get the idea.
Yeah.
And he looked and he saw all these people with long hair and bridge and tunnel people, we call them. The people coming from, they need a bridge or a tunnel to get to New York City. And he looked and he came back home and cut his hair down to a punk.
Yeah.
And there was just this sense that there was a sense of failure when one of the interesting things from my perspective during that time was not just the noise stuff, not just the grunge stuff, but there were also all these other, it was a great time for rap music. It was a great time for, all sorts of little, the garage stuff that I was, the garage punk stuff I was watching. That was blossoming. It was a great moment. And even these individual singers they weren't the same singers you'd heard before. They weren't simply doing folky music in some sort of way. They were doing something edgier.
Mm-hmm.
Lisa Germano, Juliana Hatfield, and others. And I just felt like, yeah, we just lost it.
Yeah.
Whatever the moment we had is over. And sure enough, the second half of the 90s, it's all about stuff like, like we mentioned before, neo ska, neo swing, pop punk, and other stuff like that. And then the movies had switched to becoming these kind of like teen horror films.
That's right. Yeah.
And then it kind of all ends with Britney Spears, because with Britney Spears, they finally figured out the way to exploit this really well.
Yeah.
So she starts off as the teen, but she's sexualized, turned into a little bauble.
Yeah, it's very disturbing, actually, how all that emerged and the complete corporatization of everything. Mm-hmm. It was just like we were in a perpetual mall culture, like a perpetual suburban mall culture.
Well, they were giving, when Nirvana came out, they were giving huge advances, like Babes in Toyland, who was, although they were from Minnesota, they were connected to the grunge scene. They gave them a $700,000 advance.
Yeah.
The key operative word here is advance.
Yep. And you owe that money back.
But they gave the Melvins a big chunk of change.
Yeah. They're one of the few bands that survived.
The Melvins, you're going like, well, how are you going to make your money back on them? Mudhoney.
Well, Mudhoney.
They never really got the ring, but they thought we're next. But
what was happening in Mudhoney is I watched an interview with Mark Arm, and he was smart. He says it doesn't cost us that much to make an album, so I'm just going to buy a house with this, pay off the mortgage full. So he ended up actually doing okay. But
yeah.
No.
Well, he had to pay something back at some point, though.
Yeah, no, and they did. But the thing is, that's a huge problem, and there's some interesting ironies about the way, and this was big in the 80s too. There was this kind of semi hair metal rock band in Canada called Honeymoon Suite that was really pushed at one point. And these guys, this is late 80s, their second album, they spent so much money on it, and they paid so much for their video. I know a guy who worked in the industry, he told me all about this, and they said they were just stuck constantly touring because they had to make the money back. Then you have Ian MacKaye, who forms Discord Records with Minor Threat and Fugazi. As a result of him controlling all the means of productions, he's actually a millionaire now. He ran the whole thing out of his house. And the irony is when they list musical millionaires, he's actually one of them because he didn't owe anybody anything. You know? And
that is such an important thing.
Yeah, for sure. So anyway, at that point when you saw the music dying, you felt this is the end. You did that DJing.
Well, I just felt it, like I say, leaking out. One of the things I noticed immediately is you were starting to get bands like Palace or Palace Brothers, Will Oldham. You were starting to get bands like Tortoise. You were starting to get bands that they still had this weird 90s sensibility. But what's happened is rather than being upfront and loud, they would, for instance, like Low is a great example, the band Low. They would just do these 15-minute floaty, drifty noise things.
Yeah.
Which was similar to Kurt Cobain's Endless Nameless thing. Or is it Nameless Endless? But but the difference is that whereas the earlier bands were assaulting the senses, these later bands were almost afraid to. And the people I met who were in those kinds of bands would often say to me is like, yeah, we can't do that anymore. And they would talk about, there was suddenly a division by the middle of the decade between the Unsanes and the Helmets and all of that kind of stuff, and the Rollins Band and all those. They were seen as being now these too macho, too aggressive bands.
Mm-hmm.
And the new stuff was now really subdued, but almost like unable to focus. They would let the sound just kind of drift in a beautiful way. I mean, eventually you would get groups like Sigur Rós out of those, and very interesting. Also, interestingly enough, Bjork starts to become popular.
That's right.
In the mid 90s, and that's a very different kind of thing. And you start to get to trip hop, and jungle and these other British electronic styles. The raves become more important. In New York, suddenly everyone was going to raves in the 95, 96.
Yeah.
And then that kind of was like a bubble that didn't really fit because, of course, in New York, you're going to charge a lot of money for your raves. And so that makes it a totally different kind of a thing.
Yeah. And it's interesting that it was by the later half of the 90s, people are getting more into techno and hip hop too. And they're not these bands that are kind of out front saying you got to fight for what you believe in. There's a contingent of that in say Victory Records bands, those vegan straight edge bands.
Mm-hmm.
And there was underground black metal and still a death metal scene and things like that. But you're right, it did kind of fragment, but there was this real commercialization. So I guess from you observing all those things, you kind of did a big scenery change going from downtown New York to Alaska. So
yes.
How did that happen?
But I did do some interesting things there through the radio station. I brought musicians up to play there, and one of them was Imogen Heap, who later became someone of note, winning Grammys and such for her production. And her piano concert there one summer was, as she says, the first full concert she'd ever given.
Yeah.
So I would do that. I brought Deke Dickerson and Barrett Whitfield up. He's more rockabilly country, but they both do garage rock.
Yeah.
Excellent concert. I brought up Buckwheat Zydeco.
Oh yes,
to Alaska. I brought and also there was a guy who was bringing by Kevin Burke, Irish fiddler, Johnny Cunningham. I remember a crazy time with him. He, in fact, just went increasingly nuts drinking after his show and woke up, almost missed the ferry leaving town. But it was a very different kind of a scene. Suddenly, I was more like in the folk side of the. Not that it was all folk music.
Was that a sense you're you're away from the noise and you're away from the really concentrated urban noise.
Yeah.
Did you feel at that point I need something completely different?
Well, part of it was I knew if I stayed in New York too long, I had too many friends in bands. I've not listed anything like all the people I knew in bands. And so it would keep me busy. If I just went to friends' art openings, bands that were playing with people I knew, and all of that kind of stuff, I would have no time for anything. So I wanted to break from that. And I wanted to go somewhere where I felt I thought maybe I should go to another city. And I thought what would be the point of going to Boston or San Francisco? I'm already in New York.
Yeah.
And then I thought to myself, New York ruins you for suburbs. So I said, what should I do? I said, let's go to a small place. And eventually, without going into all that story, I chose Haines, Alaska.
Wow.
And it was a great decision. Just as leaving Haines in 2018 to come live here in Georgia was a great decision. And part of that was musically based because I really like the Georgian traditional music as well as their more contemporary variations on it. It's just such an unusual style. But when I talk to Georgians here, they come over and say, oh, let's listen to this music and that music. And they're really fascinated because for them, they have their traditional music goes back disappears back in thousands of years of time. But they didn't really discover all that stuff happening in America and England and Western Europe and Japan and all of that until about the early aughts.
Wow. Yeah.
So, and then suddenly though, they had it all on computer, which meant they had no organization to it. They didn't, to them, it was just lists on a page.
Yeah.
So what I do is try to give some context.
Well, this has been an awesome conversation, Byrne. Thank you for spending time with me, explaining about the music scenes in the 80s and 90s. I think this was very rich experience that you had, and I can tell that you have a lot of passion about music and arts, and then how it fits in a sort of sociological context and the deeper meanings behind these art movements. It's very, very fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, why don't we just end it there? We'll definitely have you back on. There's numerous conversations we can have, but thank you for everyone. Please check out Byrne Power's 2 channels, the Anadrome and the Anadromist. And he actually has other channels too. You should check out those as well.
Right.
I will put them in the links. Or I'll put the links in the comment section. And thank you very much. Anything you want to part with?
Well, no, I'm very grateful to be on your channel and to just have a chance to talk and reminisce a little bit about this stuff. And I just got my journals back with me after 6 years absence. So I'll find more in there. So maybe we'll do a different version of this at some point, a couple of years down the road.
Yeah. Maybe we can look at individual scenes or something like that too. It's like, I love looking at the different scenes and the analysis and stuff. And it's a lot of history people don't know too. So that's what's good about it, speaking to someone who's actually there.
Yeah. And one of the reasons I was in New York City was to understand why music had changed so much in the 20th century. And once I'd answered that question, I felt like once I saw the Kurt Cobain ending, I just said, okay, that's the end of that story.
Yeah.
It's going to trail off. We'll eventually get the White Stripes and some Swedish garage rock and the rest of it. But basically it's going to, the story of rock as a source of meaning for people is going to trail off in a different way. Yeah,
that's for sure. Maybe I think that's another episode we should really go into.
Jazz did the same thing, so I was expecting it. So.
But we're in kind of post everything now, so it'll be interesting to see what comes next. So
now we're just stuck in the present, which is a terrible place to be stuck.
Absolutely. Everything's instantly disposable.
Right.
Okay. Well, thank you, Byrne Power. It's always great talking with you.
And thanks for having me.